Imagine a place where every secret of the ancient world was kept, a building so vast, so impossibly full of knowledge, that scholars said if you wanted to understand the universe, you went there. Not to a temple, not to a palace, to a library. Now imagine that it burned. For over 2,000 years, the destruction of the great Library of Alexandria has haunted civilization. Philosophers wept over it. Scientists have wondered what cures were lost inside it. Historians argue about who killed it, and some people, to this day, believe that if it had survived, we would be centuries ahead of where we are right now. But here's the question nobody ever fully answers. What exactly was inside? What did we actually lose? Was it really destroyed in a single catastrophic fire? Or did it vanish slowly, silently, while the world looked away? The Library of Alexandria was not just a collection of scrolls. It was the most ambitious project in human history, an attempt to gather every piece of knowledge ever written, in every language, from every corner of the known world. And what happened to it is one of history's most haunting mysteries. Let's find out what we lost, forever. To understand the library, you need to understand the world it was born into, because this was not a world of books. Books did not exist. What existed were scrolls, long strips of papyrus, hand-copied by scribes, wrapped around wooden rods, and stored in clay jars. Information was slow. Knowledge was fragile. If you wanted to read a great philosopher's work, you either lived near someone who owned a copy, or you went without. This was the 3rd century BCE, roughly 300 years before the birth of Christ. Alexander the Great had died just a generation earlier, leaving behind the largest empire ever seen. His generals had divided the empire between them. Ptolemy was clever. He was a soldier. Yes, but he was also a patron of culture. He understood that power was not just military. Power was intellectual. Power was prestige. And nothing said prestige like gathering the greatest minds in the world to your city. That city was Alexandria, a brand new coastal metropolis on the northern edge of Egypt, built by Alexander himself just before his death. It had a magnificent harbor. It had wide-planned streets. It had a diverse, cosmopolitan population drawn from across the Mediterranean world. And Ptolemy decided it would have the greatest library in history. The ancient world had libraries before. Temples in Mesopotamia kept records. Rulers in the Near East had private collections. But nothing like what Ptolemy imagined. He did not want a private archive. He wanted a universal collection. Every book, every scroll, every poem, play, scientific treatise, religious text, medical manual, and philosophical argument ever committed to writing. From Egypt, from Greece, from Persia, from India, from everywhere. The scale of this ambition was genuinely unprecedented, and somehow, for a time, they almost pulled it off. The library was founded around 285 BCE under Ptolemy the Learner, and rapidly expanded under his son Ptolemy II. It was attached to a larger institution called the Mausion, the Temple of the Muses, which was essentially the world's first research university. Scholars were not just allowed to study there. They were paid, they were housed, they were fed. All they had to do was think, write, and advance human knowledge. The first librarian, the man appointed to organize and grow this collection, was a scholar named Zenodotus of Ephesus. He was followed by other legendary figures, Callimachus, Apollonius of Rhodes, who wrote the epic poem Argonautica, and most famously, Eratosthenes of Cyrene, the man who calculated the circumference of the earth using nothing but a stick, a well, and brilliant geometry. And the collection grew at a staggering pace. The Ptolemaic rulers were obsessed with acquiring scrolls. Ships entering the harbor of Alexandria were searched, not for weapons or contraband, but for books. Any scroll found on board was seized, copied, and the original kept in the library. The owner received the copy, whether they liked it or not. Ambassadors visiting from foreign lands were asked to bring texts. Ptolemy III is said to have borrowed the official state copies of the great Athenian tragedies, works by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, promising to return them after having them copied. He paid a massive deposit as a guarantee. The library collected works in dozens of languages. Hebrew texts were brought to Alexandria and translated into Greek. The translation became the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, still used by Christian denominations today. Works from Babylon, Persia, and possibly India were gathered and translated. At its height, ancient sources claim the library held anywhere from 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls. Modern historians debate those numbers. A single scroll might contain only a portion of a longer work, so the actual number of unique texts was far smaller. But even conservatively, the library contained more written knowledge than any other institution in the ancient world, by an enormous margin. What was inside? We know some of it because it was quoted, referenced, or summarized by later authors before the originals were lost. There were the complete works of Aristotle, his writings on biology, physics, logic, politics, ethics, and rhetoric, many of which survived only in fragments. There were plays by dramatists we know only by name, dozens of tragedies and comedies now completely gone. There were scientific treatises by Aristarchus of Samos, who proposed that the Earth revolved around the Sun, when 800 years before Copernicus, a theory that might have changed science entirely if it had not been ignored and then lost. There were mathematical works, medical texts, geographical studies, and philosophical arguments that we will never read. The library was not just a storage facility, it was a living engine of knowledge production. Scholars worked there full time, editing texts, comparing different versions of the same work, writing commentaries, conducting research. Modern concepts like literary criticism, textual analysis, and even bibliography were essentially invented at Alexandria. By the 2nd century BCE, the Library of Alexandria had made the city of Alexandria the intellectual capital of the world. Athens had once held that title, the home of Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates. But Athens was a city of the past. Alexandria was the future. The greatest minds of the age came here. Archimedes, the genius who invented the Archimedes screw, calculated the value of pi, and reportedly designed war machines so terrifying they held off a Roman army, may have studied at Alexandria before returning to Syracuse. Euclid, whose work on geometry is still taught in schools today, wrote his masterpiece, Elements, while living and working in Alexandria. Hypatia, one of history's greatest female mathematicians and philosophers, would later teach there and become a symbol of the library's legacy. The city's intellectual environment was unlike anything else in the ancient world. Because the library attracted scholars from everywhere, it became a melting pot of ideas. Greek philosophy mixed with Egyptian religion. Babylonian astronomy blended with Greek mathematics. Jewish theology encountered Hellenistic philosophy. The result was a creative cross-pollination that drove centuries of innovation. The medical knowledge developed at Alexandria was particularly remarkable. Herophilus and Erasistratus, working in the 3rd century BCE, conducted detailed anatomical research, including, controversially, human dissections, which were forbidden almost everywhere else in the ancient world. Herophilus described the brain as the center of the nervous system, distinguished between arteries and veins, and recognized the connection between the pulse and the heartbeat. This was over 500 years before European medicine caught up to these conclusions. Astronomers at Alexandria mapped the stars with extraordinary precision. Hipparchus, working in the 2nd century BCE, created the first systematic star catalog, measured the length of the solar year to within 6 minutes of the modern figure, and discovered the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis. His data was so accurate it was still being used by astronomers 1,500 years later. The philosophical schools that flourished in Alexandria's intellectual atmosphere helped shape the foundations of what would become both Christianity and Islam. Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, and other hybrid philosophical religious movements emerged from this environment. The very idea of reconciling faith with reason, a project that would occupy centuries of medieval scholars, was partly born in the libraries and lecture halls of Alexandria. This was not just a great library, this was a civilization's brain, the place where humanity was making its greatest leap forward in understanding the world. And it was about to face forces it could not survive. The library's decline was not the result of a single event. This is one of the great misconceptions of history. Most people, if asked, will say, Julius Caesar burned it, or the Christians destroyed it, or the Arab conquest ended it. The truth is darker and more complicated. The library died slowly, killed by politics, neglect, violence, and the simple passage of time. The first serious blow came in 48 BCE, during Julius Caesar's visit to Alexandria. Caesar had become entangled in a succession dispute between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy III. Fighting broke out in the harbor. To prevent the enemy fleet from being used against him, Caesar ordered his ships burned. The fire spread to the docks, and ancient sources differ on what happened next. Some say it spread to a warehouse near the harbor that stored books bound for export. Others say it reached the library itself. The Roman writer Livy claimed that 400,000 scrolls were destroyed. Modern historians are skeptical of that number, and many believe the fire hit only a warehouse, not the main library building. But even if the library survived Caesar's fire largely intact, the damage was real. The institution never fully recovered its former confidence. The political instability that followed, the collapse of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the suicide of Cleopatra, the incorporation of Egypt into the Roman Empire, changed everything. Under Roman rule, the library continued to function, but the extraordinary royal patronage that had built it was gone. Roman emperors occasionally funded it, but none with the obsessive commitment of the early Ptolemies. The collection stopped growing at the same pace. Some scholars moved away. Funding became unreliable. Then came the reign of Emperor Aurelian in 273 CE. A rebellion in Alexandria led to brutal military suppression. The Bruchaion, the royal quarter where the library was located, was largely destroyed. How much of the library survived this assault is unknown, but almost certainly the damage was catastrophic. The intellectual atmosphere of Alexandria was also changing. The city that had once celebrated pluralism and the free exchange of ideas was becoming increasingly divided along religious lines. As Christianity spread and became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, the pagan philosophical tradition centered at the Mouseion came under growing pressure and suspicion. The single most dramatic moment in the library's decline came in 391 CE. The Roman Emperor, Theodosius, had declared Christianity the official religion of the empire and issued edicts ordering the closure of pagan temples. In Alexandria, a Christian mob led by the patriarch Theophilus attacked and destroyed the Serapeum, the great temple of Serapis, which many scholars believe had by then become the secondary home of the library's collection after the original building's destruction. The philosopher Hypatia, one of the last great scholars in Alexandria's tradition, witnessed this destruction. She continued to teach mathematics, astronomy, and Neoplatonic philosophy, respected by both pagans and moderate Christians for her brilliance. But in 415 CE, she was murdered by a mob of Christian extremists who associated her with the pagan governor Orestes and saw her learning as a threat. Her murder is often taken as the symbolic end of the classical Alexandrian intellectual tradition, not because she was the last scholar — people continued to study and write in Alexandria for centuries — but because her death signaled how thoroughly the atmosphere had changed. The open, curious, pluralistic spirit that had built the library was being replaced by something far more dangerous to knowledge: certainty. The final and often misunderstood chapter came with the Arab conquest of Egypt in 641 CE. A famous story, repeated for centuries, claims that the Caliph Omar ordered the library's remaining books burned, declaring, "If these books agree with the Quran, they are superfluous. If they disagree, they are pernicious." This story is almost certainly a later fabrication, with no contemporary sources to support it. Arab scholars of the period were, in fact, among the great preservers of ancient knowledge, translating and protecting many Greek texts that would otherwise have been lost entirely. By the time of the Arab conquest, there is little evidence that any significant portion of the original library still existed. It had already been dying for centuries. The Arab conquest did not destroy the library. They arrived to find it was already gone. So what specifically was lost? This is the question that haunts historians and scientists most deeply, and it is impossibly difficult to answer. We know what we know existed, because later writers mentioned it. We have no idea what was lost without being mentioned at all, and given that most ancient writing has perished, the unmentioned losses may be the greatest losses of all. We know that there were complete works of Aristotle, over 200 treatises mentioned in ancient catalogues. Only 31 survive. We have fragments and titles. We have second-hand descriptions, but the rest is silence. We know that Aristarchus of Samos wrote detailed arguments for a heliocentric universe. Almost none of it survives. Had his work been preserved and widely read, the scientific revolution might have come 15 centuries earlier. We know there were plays. Sophocles wrote 123 plays. 7 survive. Euripides wrote around 90 plays. We have 18. Aeschylus wrote somewhere between 70 and 90 plays. We have 7. The works we call classics, Oedipus Rex, Medea, Agamemnon, are the survivors of a vast catastrophe. We are reading the scraps. There were medical texts describing surgical techniques that Renaissance surgeons would have considered miraculous. There were geographical surveys of regions of Africa and Asia that Europeans would not explore again for 1,000 years. There were philosophical arguments we can only guess at from the arguments made against them. Perhaps, most painfully, there may have been technological knowledge now lost that could have changed history. Hero of Alexandria, working in the 1st century CE, described a device called an aeolipile, a primitive steam engine. He treated it as a curiosity. But if the full body of Alexandrian mechanical and mathematical knowledge had survived and been built upon, the Industrial Revolution might have happened in ancient Rome rather than 18th century England. That is the real weight of what was lost. Not just information, but the momentum of a civilization. The Library of Alexandria was humanity's first serious attempt to organize and accelerate the accumulation of knowledge. When it died, so did that momentum. The world did not simply stand still. In many ways, it went backward. The Dark Ages that followed were not inevitable. They were, at least in part, the result of losing the knowledge, the institutions, and above all the spirit that the library represented. It took over 1,000 years for humanity to rebuild a comparable infrastructure of knowledge. The printing press, the university system, the scientific method, all of these were, in a sense, attempts to reconstruct what Alexandria had once already achieved.